Hello, welcome to another midweek message. In John chapter 4, Jesus said, "True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." If we are going to truly worship God, that is, if we are going to worship Him in a way that pleases Him, we're going to have to engage the deeper part of who we are. We're going to have to worship with our spirit. That is, engage our mind, our intellect, our will, and our emotion. But we are also going to have to worship in truth. That is, according to the standard of truth that God has revealed in His Word. If we're going to please the Lord in our worship, we must get back to the law and to the testimony. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 20. We need to get back to the Bible. We need to learn how Christians in the Bible worshiped God. We know that that pleases Him. We need to model our conduct accordingly. Let's get back to the Bible. In Acts chapter 2, when the very first people became Christians, we read about their activities immediately following their conversion. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, we learn that they were continually devoting themselves. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. Among the things that the very first Christians committed themselves to as a part of their worship to God was prayer. It is one of the most fundamental spiritual disciplines. It has always been a vital part of any person's relationship with God, regardless of the time and place in which they lived. And it is certainly nonetheless true regarding Christians. If we're going to worship God acceptably, our worship needs to involve prayer. I think most religious people would accept that without much debate or without much question at all. But the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of things done with prayer in the religious world that aren't consistent with the teaching of the Lord in the New Testament. For example, consider what Jesus said on the subject of prayer during His Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus said in Matthew 6, beginning in verse 5, "When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless or vain repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then in this way, Our Father who is in heaven." There are several fundamental things about prayer that Jesus teaches in this passage. This passage is talking about personal, individual, or private prayer primarily. But there are principles taught here that would certainly apply to the prayers that we might offer in the context of our worship, our assembled worship as a church. Jesus taught that prayer must not be hypocritical. It must not be, first, to be seen by men. We read in the New Testament of Christians praying together in the collective, in the assembly. When someone is leading an assembly in prayer, that is, when one person is speaking the words of a prayer and all are participating in their hearing and in their agreement, the person who is leading that prayer can't be doing it just to draw attention to himself. The prayer is directed toward God. It's not about the person who's speaking the words. Secondly, Jesus teaches in this passage that prayer ought not involve meaningless or vain repetition. That is, It is not merely the recitation or the repetition of certain words that in themselves have spiritual value. Jesus goes on in this passage to offer what is commonly called the Lord's Prayer. It is, in fact, a model prayer that Jesus uses to show by example the content and the approach that we ought to take in our prayers. But Jesus said, don't use meaningless or vain repetition. Don't just recite the same words over and over again as if there is value there. Many have taken to the recitation and repetition of this model prayer as if there is some holiness inherent to it. That's not what Jesus taught. Prayer needs to be the genuine expression of our own hearts, not merely the repetition of some formula of words. Third, in this passage, Jesus teaches that prayer ought to be directed to our Father who is in heaven. God is the audience or the object of our prayers. He is the one to whom we are bringing our praise, our thanksgiving, our petitions and supplications. God is the one that we are calling upon in our prayers. There are some who will attempt to pray to so-called saints, that is, those who have been venerated by some denominational hierarchy, those who have died already and been exalted to some artificial position in the minds of men. Others will pray to Mary, the mother of Jesus. You will not find any of that in the pages of the New Testament. God is the object of our prayers. He is the one to whom we need to be addressing. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. We need to be talking to God. Fourth, we need to be praying with understanding. Paul says so in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. That is, we need to have our minds engaged in our prayers. Again, not meaningless or vain repetition, not merely the recitation of some formula or prayers that have been written in some book, but rather engaging ourselves in our prayers. Fifth and finally, we learn in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5 that Jesus is our one mediator between God and man, and our prayers need to go through Him. Some would claim they're not actually praying to saints or to Mary, they're just praying through them. But again, you won't find that in the Bible. You will find prayers addressed to God the Father through Jesus Christ, the Son, who is our mediator with God. If we're going to worship God acceptably, if we're going to worship in truth, we need to continue steadfastly in the business of prayer. It needs to be a regular and disciplined part of our worship. But it must be according to truth. It needs to be according to the pattern we find in the New Testament. That is, not hypocritical to be drawing the attention of men, not with vain repetition or merely the repetition or recitation of words. It needs to be addressed to God the Father with the understanding of our minds through Jesus Christ the Son. Those who truly worship God will worship in spirit and truth, and that includes our prayers. Thanks so much for watching.